Thank you, Tim. It is such a pleasure for us to be here this morning. I mean, honestly, for me, it's just such a pleasure to be in a room with other people, right? I mean, for a lot of us, it's been a long time in coming. Some of you, your school committee meetings are back in person again, and with a lot of the issues that you've been having to deal with, perhaps you've had packed houses. But for some of us, being in a room like this feels a little foreign and really, really refreshing. So we're delighted to be here. I'm also personally delighted to be in this particular room of people because, for one, I know a good number of you and had such a pleasure getting to serve with you on school committee, on the Rhode Island Association of School Committees. I was looking to see if any of my former East Greenwich peeps were here. I saw some, Tim, there, good to see you, representing, awesome. Thank you. To be in a room of such dedicated public servants, this is an unusual room. There are few people who would be willing to step up to the plate in the way that you have and in the way that you've had to over the last couple of years. So I really just want to start by saying thank you, because you don't get thanked enough. It oftentimes feels like a thankless job, but you have one of the most difficult and important jobs of any elected official in the state. And it's important to remember that and to have that perspective and to know that you are making a big difference in the state. I wanted to start by sharing a little bit of a story that kind of speaks to the challenges of being a school committee member. I remember when I first was running back in 2012, I was involved in politics in a variety of different capacities prior to running for office myself. And I had an opportunity to be in the office of the Speaker of the House in the General Assembly. And he knew that I was running for office, and he said, you know, people oftentimes ask me how I got my start in politics. And they say, you know, did you start by running at the local level? You know, did you ever run and serve on a school committee? And I will never forget what he said. He said, I never would have done that. And I said, why? He said, it is the hardest elected job of any other elected office in the entire country. And I remember thinking to myself, well, first, oh my goodness, what am I getting myself into? But this was coming from the person who at the time was considered to be the single greatest lightning rod in the entire state of Rhode Island. His leadership sometimes was controversial, and for him to say, I never would have done school committee, I think is really telling. So again, I just want to thank you for your service, and I'm just so happy to be able to be in this room again. I decided not to run again in 2020. My children had graduated from the schools. My husband and I decided to move back to the big city, so I'm no longer in East Greenwich. I'm in Providence now. But I have to say that serving on school committee was some of the most personally and professionally rewarding work I have ever done in my entire life. And as I was wrapping up my term of service, I was starting to reflect on what was it about serving on school committee that I loved so much and felt so aligned with. And I realized it's not that I relished the conflict. Conflict is never fun. But I found that I took a tremendous amount of pleasure in being able to help facilitate a process that could move us through it and get to a productive place. Because so often conflict derails the important work that we do. And I felt like I was on school committee for 8 years, I was chair for 6. Goodness knows I didn't do everything perfectly. But I think what I did do pretty well is to help navigate some pretty tough times. Nothing like what you've had to deal with over the last 2 years, but some challenging times. And I found that I really loved that work. And so I started to think about how I was going to spend my time next and decided to take a basic mediation training through the Center for Mediation. And that has set me on a completely different course and path in my life. I've become a professional mediator. And I'm doing that work in district court, doing landlord-tenant work, doing small claims work. I'm doing workplace mediations, which I love to do specifically within nonprofit, mission-driven organizations. And I was actually just recently hired as a contract mediator with RIDE, doing special education mediations. So while I'm no longer serving on school committee, I'm still looking for ways to stay connected to the good work of public education in the state. And being able to be here today with all of you is just another opportunity for me to be able to continue to do this work. One of the things that I've enjoyed most about getting into the mediation work is I did join the board of the Center for Mediation and Collaboration of Rhode Island. It's a community mediation center that's been around for 25 years, best kept secret in the entire state of Rhode Island. They do amazing work. And it's given me the opportunity to meet amazing people like Tricia.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. So I just have a couple of quick words to echo what Carolyn said. First of all, thank you. I'm a product of public schools here in Rhode Island. Our two daughters are products of public schools here in Rhode Island, and without the work of folks like you, it would have been a much rockier time. I just want to give a special shout out to my East Bay friends from Barrington and Bristol Warren. Thank you for being here today, especially as a resident of that area. But really to all of you, as Carolyn said, this is a challenging time to just be a human, right? This is a really challenging time. And humans like you who step up and step into areas that maybe you didn't know there was going to be this much conflict, but you probably knew it wasn't going to be just a primrose path. And so really, really appreciate not only you making that leap into public service, but also, frankly, taking your time today to continue to develop your skills. I'm sure that all of you had at least one other thing you could have been doing this morning, and I appreciate that you're spending a little bit of time with us here today. As Carolyn said, conflict is sort of a natural part of life. It's a natural part of our world. And conflict can do one of two things. It can either really throw you off track, or it can show you the path to a new way. And so what we're hoping today, we're just going to be very brief in our time here today, but we're hoping that we show you a little bit about how conflict, can actually be the bridge to something a little bit better. So hang on, stay in your seats for now, because we're going to move in a minute, but we're going to get ready. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about the current climate. Again, it's probably going to be surprising to find out that there's conflict in your world. But just, close your eyes, try and imagine if you were in a world with conflict, what that would be like. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of the roots of conflict. There's some theory that goes to this. There are some things we're going to share with you. We're going to talk about what successful relationships look like. We're going to spend a little bit of time on what we call the personal conflict assessment. And what we love about this is it really gives you a chance to sort of sit and think about how you personally approach conflict. We're going to ask you to think about that in your role on the school committee, but rest assured, this is also something that you can take back and use in sort of other areas of your life. We're also going to spend a little time on skills and strategies, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what's next. So hopefully you're ready to go. We're definitely ready to go. We're very excited. We're grateful to our RIASC for inviting us in today. We feel like we have some things to share, but this is definitely sort of a give and take. We have some things to share, but we know that you have experiences and things to share back with us. So we're looking forward to our conversation. So thanks so much.
So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the current climate. Any one of you could get up and talk about the current climate. I don't need to tell you what you've been dealing with over the last couple of years. School communities have always been conflict-ridden places, as my conversation with the Speaker of the House 10 years ago indicated. But obviously, over the last couple of years, things have come to a fever pitch. And it's having an impact. It's having an impact in all through the leadership chain, I would say, in school communities. The American Association of School Administrators did a study and saw that about 25% of superintendents resigned in 2021. There's been all this talk about the Great Resignation. Well, when it comes to superintendents, it's actually been true. I mean, it's typically been closer, turnover has typically been closer to about 15%. So we're seeing a lot of churning with staff. There are school committee members that are not completing their terms. There's staff turnover within the schools. It has been a very unsteady time. And it's taken a toll, I think, on a lot of us personally and professionally. And what's so frustrating about it is there's so much work to do to make up for the learning loss that our students have experienced over the last couple of years, but conflict oftentimes and issues that sidetrack us are getting in the way of our doing the work that we really need to be doing, which is focusing on student achievement. So what I want you to do now is most of you should have pens and something to write on. I want you to write down the top 2 to 3 most challenging conflicts that come to mind for you that have arisen between and among your school committee members and your superintendent over the last year or two. Now, Tim mentioned this conversation about conflict. We could be talking about conflict between school committees and communities. We could be talking about lots of different kinds of conflict. For the purposes of our presentation, since you're going to have a community-focused workshop at following hours, we're going to focus on the superintendent-school committee relationship. So I want you to think about the top 2 to 3 most challenging conflicts that have arisen between and among your members and your superintendent over the last couple of years. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just think about those conflicts. And when you can think about those examples, what was it about? What do you see as kind of the root cause of it? And yes, just keep it to 2 to 3. What you to do now is in small groups of about 3 or 4 people, and ideally, I'd like to see you mix it up a little bit. So try to make sure that you're not all from the same district. Just small groups of 3 or 4 so that in about 8 to 10 minutes, you each have time to share with the group some of the conflicts that you've been dealing with in your districts. Yeah, no, if you need to get up and move so that you can be part of another group, go ahead and do that. We're not going to take the time to count off or anything, but I'd like for you to try to mix it up a little bit. You know, even in the best of situations where school committees and superintendents have wonderful working relationships, conflict is inevitable. So it's not a big surprise that you could probably talk about this for the rest of the morning. Now, if we had more time this morning, we would very systematically go around to all of the groups and get a formal report out on what you discussed and, you know, talk about emerging themes and things like that. Since our time is limited this morning, and this is really just kind of an introductory, you know, piece on conflict resolution, we're not going to quite do that. But what I would like to do is kind of popcorn style. For anybody who would like to share examples that you discussed in your groups, we're going to do that for a few minutes. So who would like to share one of the conflicts that you identified and kind of how you talked about what the root cause of that conflict was?
I was just going to say that in Smithfield, we are a small community, and we always took part in things that happened in our schools. And I'm spoiled, I'll admit it, because the former superintendents we had always let us know, if you would like to come, X is happening. Well, a lot of X's has happened with this particular superintendent. We never knew about it. And it got to a point, because if you're out grocery shopping, you're asked, where were you, or what happened, can you fill us in? And I have to say, I don't know. So my standard reply became, I don't know.
Great, thank you for sharing that example. Who'd like to share another example?
Thank you, Carolyn. When I work on a committee where none of us have any children in the district, which at one time when I first ran was the reason I ran, because I had children in the district, but have quickly learned that I have to separate myself. Now that I don't have any children in the district, I have to separate myself from and look at the district as a whole. And one of the conflicts that we had in our committee is that there were grandchildren of one of the members in the district. And when we were going through the we gave 3 options, of course, full in-person, distance learning, full distance, or a hybrid. But the choice made by perhaps the parents of the grandchild was not what he wanted to see happen, and consequently, he felt that the district needed to reevaluate how we did this. I think there was, how we came to a resolution was that we asked him to separate himself from being grandpa and look at the district as a whole, and if you had 2,500, 3,000 students, the parents of those children coming in with the same concern, where that would put us. Because as a whole, I feel West Warwick did a fabulous job in, during this crisis, health crisis, but thank you.
Great, thank you for sharing that example. That's a great one. Who else would like to share an example of a conflict that you discussed at your table? Marianne.
So this was a resignation. So we had a member, you know, when you're elected to a school committee, you usually come with some kind of an agenda, right? I find that agendas are really important because that's why you do anything, right? But we had one member who had been elected who came to us from our budget board with a very specific agenda. And within 2 years, it was in the, just not quite to the halfway point, it became clear to him he wouldn't be able to get done what he wanted done. He couldn't find a way to work, either with a superintendent, with a finance director, with other members of the committee. And so I think, frankly, the COVID crisis just came, you know, was kind of icing on the cake. And he saw clearly that, you know, there was no way forward for him to feel productive. And so he resigned. So it wasn't related to the current crisis, but it was something that emerged.
Great, thank you for that. I see you back there, I'm coming. You know what? Be sure you have permission to share somebody else's example before you do.
I'm gonna. No, it's a beautiful example because I think it crosses to every school committee. Is when you have a superintendent who, I think it all comes back to communication, who's meeting with only certain members, and not your full school committee. No. But any superintendent, when you're only meeting with certain school committee members and you're not informing your whole board, not only are you creating conflict between you and your board, but you're creating conflict among your board.
That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. These aren't always easy conversations, but it does help when the person perhaps you're referring to is not actually in the room. No, thank you for sharing those examples. You know, I think for me, having served for 8 years on school committee and having had the opportunity to become kind of both a student and a practitioner of conflict resolution, it has been really helpful for me to understand that there is theory behind conflict, and that when you learn that theory and can see what you've experienced through the lens of that theory, it's actually really helpful, because when you can really identify what the root cause of the problem is, you're in a much better position to be able to start to productively address it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand the mic back over to Tricia, who's going to kind of take us through a little bit of the theory about where conflict comes from.
All right, thank you so much, Carolyn. And thank you to everyone for sharing. I know it's always sort of hard to be the first one to raise your hand and say, hey, we have this conflict. But again, as Carolyn said, it's always nice when that person's not in the room. So good job, everyone. So as Carolyn mentioned, there's some theory behind conflict. And you all have a packet on your table. And in your packet, you have a wheel of conflict that looks different than the one on the screen. And the reason is because there are some differences in how people look at the roots of conflict. Okay? We're going to use this one because it's kind of simple, it's nice and colorful, and frankly, it's the one on the screen, so we're going to go with this one. So this comes from a book called The Dynamics of Conflict Resolution, so good source. And really what it talks about is how every conflict has a root source. Right? Every conflict comes from something. And if you're an individual and you need something, then the likelihood is that at some point you are going to engage in conflict, right? So if you look at the wheel, the needs are right in the center because they always are in the center. Because no matter how altruistic you are, no matter how much you can walk in someone else's shoes or how much you can see the other side, at the end of the day, your needs are your needs. Okay? So that is front and center. We have to keep that in mind. So as you go around the conflict wheel, so I think most of the examples that I heard just a few minutes ago had to do with the communication slide, right? Communication could be, I'm not speaking clearly, you're not hearing me, and we go around and around and around. And sometimes it doesn't really matter where the breakdown is, but if the communication is not clear, then there's likely to be conflict. It could be as simple as, I wanted eggs for breakfast and you thought I wanted waffles. Or it could be as more complex, as someone over here I think said, I'd like to have some information that I used to get and now I'm not getting it anymore, right? So communication always, always breeds some sort of conflict because humans are imperfect communicators, right? Inside your head, you might be a perfect communicator, but what comes out of your mouth and what someone else hears, very different, okay? So the second piece of the wheel of conflict is emotions. This really doesn't need too much explanation, but I'll just say it. People are really invested, right? And I guess that's something that I try to think about a lot when I think about conflict and how sort of heated it gets sometimes. It's because people are invested. I guess what I would be more concerned about is if no one cared. Right? Now, I know sometimes it might be nice to have a meeting where, quote, no one cares, and so no one's jumping up and down and saying lots of things. I get that. But I guess that's really not the way we want to be as a society, right? We want people who are invested. We want you to be invested on the committee level, and we want our citizens to be invested as well. So emotions are always going to breed conflict. Excuse me. History is an interesting one. Have you ever had a conflict with someone and then you found some information out and it changed your perspective? Right? I mean, that's kind of a very common thing to happen. When you hear, quote, the rest of the story, when you hear the backstory, when you hear what's happened before, sometimes that changes our mind. Sometimes it doesn't, but what it always does is it gives us more information. It gives us a little bit more empathy, perhaps, when you hear the historical perspective on something that's going on. And that takes a lot of different shapes and sizes, but it's always important. It's really hard to come in and just start. There's always someone who came before, and there's always someone who's going to follow you. Okay? So structure, for a process person like myself, this is super hard, right? So what structure refers to are all of the limits that are out there. It could be time limits. It could be the number of seats in a room. It could be a policy. It could be a law. It could be anything that is providing structure for the work that you're doing. And again, this tends to breed conflict because I think I heard someone say, we're just going to write a new policy and we'll change something, right? Or, oh, we're going to have the meeting at this time instead of this time. Or we're only going to have 10 seats instead of 100 seats, right? So there are all sorts of ways that structure plays into the conflict wheel. So the last one, and we saved this for last because frankly, it's really hard, is all about values, right? Most humans are driven by their values. Again, that's why your needs are right in the center, right? These are values that you have from wherever you have them. Maybe they're the values you grew up with, maybe they're the values you developed, maybe they're the values of the community that you belong to, but you have a set of values. And maybe you express them, and maybe you don't. Maybe you don't even realize you have them until you get pushed on something. And then suddenly, oh, I'm not okay with that. This part of the conflict wheel is the most difficult, right? All of the other ones, we can probably kind of sort out, right? So if Carolyn and I have a miscommunication, I can stop, take a minute, say, Carolyn, did you understand that? And if she says no, I can say, okay, let me try to do that a different way, okay? We can address some of the emotions. Maybe I need a little time out. Maybe I just need to cool down for a minute. We can talk about the history. We can adjust the structure. Boy, it's real hard to adjust my values. It's real hard, okay? And so the values piece is what tends to breed the most conflict. When I think that you are not respecting my values, when I think you're trying to trump my values, when I think that you're trying to, when you're not being cognizant of how important my values are to me. And this is the part of the conflict wheel where we tend to get very entrenched, okay? We tend to say, this is my values. And you also hear values used a lot to become entrenched. So maybe it's not really a values issue. Maybe it really is a communication issue. But boy, if I throw out that word values, it's hard for you to come back, right? It's hard for people to sort of go back and forth on something like values. Okay? So this wheel is just a really great way of talking about where conflict comes from. And as we've said sort of all along, it's really important to know. It's not going to change. Are you still going to have conflict? Of course you are. But sometimes knowing where it comes from on the wheel gives you a little bit of a pause. A little bit of a pause to sort of consider the other side, consider the perspective, consider where it's coming from, and then, most importantly, figure out your strategy, right? Now, some people are really, really naturally gifted at this. If you think about the people in your world, both in sort of your school committee world and the rest of your world, you can probably think of some people that you're like, oh, wow, yeah, she's really good at kind of de-escalating things, kind of keeping the calm in the room, right? For the rest of us, this is a learned skill. It's okay if you don't have it right now, because you can learn it. And that's really, really important. This is not something that people sort of come to the table with all the time, but it is something that you can learn. And once you do learn it, it's going to make it much easier to figure out, again, that path. So we talked about conflict as having the power to either derail, get you off track, or potentially be that bridge to a really good solution that might actually be better than you kind of thought it could be. So keeping in mind where things come from is really important so you can figure out where you're going.
So there's been thank you for that, Tricia. I mean, for me, this was revelatory. And it's not to say that I didn't think that I naturally did some of this, but I think it helped me to understand better what it was that I did when it worked and what it was that I wasn't doing when it didn't work. And I think especially not recognizing history. When you come onto a school committee and your children are young and you're new and other people have been there since their children graduated, you realize you're not walking into a blank slate. And I think probably in my early days, more than once, I put my foot in my mouth, not understanding and respecting the history that was represented in the room. So anyway, I found this to be incredibly helpful. But outside of conflict resolution theory, there has been a lot of really good work about what is required, what the essential elements are for a successful school committee superintendent relationship. And I would be remiss if we didn't kind of go through this together, because there's just a lot of good information in here. What I'll say about this is that literally each and every one of these pieces could be a day-long workshop in and of itself. So with that in mind, we're just going to go through it together. So this is from an article that was written recently by Lori Capullo, who basically was written in 2021, who was really doing kind of a summary of the literature regarding the research that's been done on successful school board superintendent relationships. So the first thing that she says is that community input on the development of the district's vision and ensuring that the superintendent is aligned with that vision is an absolutely essential element for a successful school committee superintendent relationship. Now, quite a number of you in the room, because there has been so much turnover over the last couple of years, are having a fresh start with a new superintendent or a new interim who's recently come on board. Or you've recently redone your strategic plan. And what Laura Capullo points out is that the most effective and important place to start in terms of a successful relationship is at the beginning. And you have an opportunity to do that with the new superintendent. You also have an opportunity to do that every time you redo the strategic plan, because that is an opportunity to do a reset, both as a committee and as a community. So super important. Clearly defined responsibilities. This is an interesting one. There was a time where I feel like this conversation about people need to stay in their lane just made a lot more sense, because the lanes were pretty clearly defined. And I think what's happened over the last few years is you have this combination of education reform in the state, which is resulting in new and different levels of authority to do different kinds of things within school districts. And then also the pandemic, where everybody's out of their element and dealing with things that nobody has had to deal with before. And at the end of the day, there's an argument to be made that everything impacts student achievement. And so when that's your primary responsibility as a school committee member, and the sands are shifting underneath you in terms of those roles and responsibilities, getting to a place where they can be clearly defined is hard, and it's the work. I wish it was as simple as just staying in our lanes. Now, obviously, some roles and responsibilities are more clearly delineated than others, but the fact that they have been shifting, I think, is a challenge. And so anything you can do to try to revisit roles and responsibilities and come to some consensus around what those are, I think is important. And communication, of course, is key in that. Mutual respect. Everybody has been dealing with a lot. Superintendents have been dealing with a lot, faculty and staff have been dealing with a lot, school committee members have been dealing with a lot as school committee members and also in their own lives. One of the essential elements to a successful relationship is just having respect for the fact that you're all in the room, you're all there to do good work, you all care about the same things, and it's hard. It's hard right now, and you have to figure out a way to have a productive relationship. And oftentimes, because it's hard and things do get derailed, you have to work extra hard to redirect the conversation to the things that really matter the most. There's a lot of noise out there that can detract you from your primary mission to focus on student achievement. And figuring out how to redirect, to minimize the noise, and to work with your superintendent to really focus on what matters and to reduce infighting amongst the leadership in the district is of paramount importance. Flexibility and collaboration rather than authoritativeness. So this article basically says that authority relationships function beautifully until the environment changes, right? So we talked about that. So the environment, the landscape has changed dramatically over the last couple of years. Again, both because of education reform and also because of the pandemic. So, so not that I ever favor authority types of relationships, but there are situations in which they can actually work pretty well, but not when you have a consistently changing landscape. You need to be able to work flexibly and collaboratively as you are tackling new challenges. And then prioritization of student achievement. There was this Lighthouse study that was done a number of years ago where they were looking at the most high-performing districts in the country. And basically what they found is that those districts that had the greatest results in terms of student achievement had school committee members and superintendents, primarily school committee members, who identified student achievement as their #1 priority. Again, when you have oversight responsibilities in a school district, you can make the case that absolutely everything that you do connects to student achievement, but the districts that actually focus on the academic piece as opposed to the operational piece tend to have greater outcomes than those that get mired in the operational stuff. For me, they are absolutely necessary, but completely not sufficient. For me, those 5 essential elements are all fantastic preventative strategies, but they don't help you when it comes to getting into a conflict and trying to figure out a productive way to get out of it. So for me, the missing piece is an understanding of an ability to productively address conflict both individually and collectively. And that's where I have found that the work of the Center for Mediation has been critically important. Can everybody see that? I love this one. Because again, you can make a case that as a school committee, the buck stops with you. Your responsibility is general oversight of the school district. And sometimes the lines are not that clear about who is responsible for doing what. And sometimes we overstep. And so this idea that in hindsight, I believe that our oversight was short-sighted, at least that's my insight, I think is a really clever way of saying it's important, I think, for every individual who serves on a school committee and for every school committee to be reflective about how you carry out your primary function, which is to oversee a school district. And to do that in a manner that gets you to where you're trying to go, which is to improve student achievement. And figuring out your relationship with the superintendent in a way that allows them to step fully into their leadership role and be the instructional leader in the district and to be the operational leader in the district with the support, but not the undue interference of the committee itself. But again, the lines are difficult to navigate, and it's why figuring out how to handle conflict more productively is just such an important element to this whole puzzle. There are a lot of tools. Yeah, question, yeah.
So my insight is that I find you have, as a committee, you don't just come into getting in that space where you're overstepping. I feel like it's the community at large that can bring you there. In other words, instead of parents going through the chain of command, they come directly to the school board, and then that's how the school board becomes overstepping, right? And they're in this role where instead of allowing your superintendent to do the job, you're doing it. And so to me, that becomes this big cabaclo, you know? So.
I'm so glad that you shared that, because when I think about who I was as a school committee member for my first 2 years on the committee, again, that young parent that was just, you know, I came onto the committee to be a rabble-rouser. There was change that I felt like it needed to happen. And I think a lot of us can kind of suffer from this hero complex where we want to be able to just waltz in and save the day. And what I learned, perhaps not as quickly as maybe I should have, is that, it's an awesome responsibility to be a school committee member. And one of the most important roles that you can play is helping to educate the community about how to navigate the system. To understand that if you're truly committed to structural change, to sustainable change, it's not going to come if you as an individual school committee member try to come in and solve one particular problem, right? You have to be thinking about things from a more systemic point of view. And so I don't remember exactly when it happened. I know it didn't happen in my first 2 years. Maybe it didn't happen until I became chair of the committee. But my conversations with members of the community changed pretty dramatically. I was always there to listen. I was always there to receive feedback. But when it came to an action that needed to be taken, it was helping the parent to navigate the channels, the appropriate channels, that could best address what their concerns were. But it's hard when you've got people who are in pain, who are concerned about their kids, and you want to take up the mantle for them. But usually the most productive thing that you can do is to help them understand what the steps are that they need to take to be able to get their issue resolved. Thank you for bringing that up.
Connected with other parents that believe that they know better than everyone else, and how do you deal with that?
You know, it's a really great question. We're limited in time for what we can do, but what I know is that the next workshop is about communication and authentic and meaningful ways to engage the community. And what I oftentimes found is that if there was a member of the community, connected to a school committee member or not, who was acting out in unproductive ways, it was really up to the district to figure out, well, how do I harness that? How do I channel that so that it can actually, so that the person can feel like they've been heard and feel some level of confidence that their concern is being addressed. I think it's important to think structurally, to think about process when it comes to that, and my hope is in your next workshop when you're talking about authentic opportunities to engage community members, that those are exactly the conversations that you're going to have. There's lots of different strategies for dealing with conflict, again, between and among school committee members and superintendents, and between district leadership and the community. Because we just have a limited amount of time, there's one particular strategy that Tricia and I want to focus on with you. And that really is about giving you an opportunity to reflect on your own conflict style. Because who you are in any conflict-ridden situation is going to determine whether you become part of the problem or you become part of the solution. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn it back over to Tricia, and she's going to introduce this conflict assessment, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Carolyn. So Carolyn said we were talking to school folks, so there's a test. So this is it. You guys ready for the test, the big test? So what we have for you today is, can you just flick up to the next? So what we have for you today is a little activity. It's called the conflict inventory. And would you mind passing we're going to pass them out to you. It looks like this. We're going to take a few minutes and have each one of you fill out your own individual conflict style. And what I'd like you to think about is your conflict style as it pertains to your role on the school committee. Because if you think about your conflict style, maybe at work or in your family, it might be slightly different. So let's focus on your role at the school committee. You're going to get a nice little packet like this that Carolyn's handing out to you. If you need a pen, we have pens. Essentially, this is what we're going to do. There's a series of questions, and there's a little rating scale for you. Okay? The first group of questions from A to O are asking you how you respond to conflict sort of at the very beginning, when you're starting to feel like there's some differences, you're starting to feel like maybe you're not all on the same page. And then the remainder of the questions refer to how you respond to conflict when it starts to escalate, starts to feel bad, you're like, ooh, conflict is coming. So take about 5 minutes or so. Again, you're thinking about your conflict style as it relates to your work on the school committee, okay? For those of you who are overachievers and who are going to skip ahead to the tally, I mean, go right ahead, but we are going to lead you through that, but no judgment if that's your personal style, so go right ahead. So what you should have on your tally side of the sheet is you should have some numbers that kind of give you an indication of your sort of dominant conflict style in a situation that you might find yourself on during your school committee service. And what you'll see on the tally sheet is there are columns, and the columns are labeled calm and storm. So if you would take a minute and just circle the number of your highest score that says calm, and also circle your highest number that's storm. If you've tied, that's okay, just circle them all. Because one of the really important things to know is that although you may have a dominant conflict style, that style may also change when things get a little dicey, right? So during calm conditions, that's sort of the precursor, right? Everything is business as usual. People are pretty much on the same page. You can kind of get things, you can move things forward in a way that doesn't feel tense. You know, everyone kind of knows what that feels like. you're not really upset or anxious yet. This is sort of day-to-day decision-making stuff, right? Everyone's kind of on the same page, we're moving along. And then what happens is things get a little dicey, right? Maybe we've tried to resolve some things and it hasn't worked. Maybe you're surprised that something didn't work. Typically emotions are rising. People are getting a little more anxious. When people are when there's a storm condition, you will find that voices get louder, they get faster, body language changes. You literally, I mean, I know it was just May the 4th, but you feel a shift in the force, right? Like things suddenly are not the way they were, or the way that you want them to be, perhaps. So your conflict style may, in fact, shift according to the type of according to the type of conditions that you have. So that's something to keep in mind. So the other thing to keep in mind is that there are 5 styles, and every single style can be helpful, and every single style can be less helpful. Okay? So there's no like, oh, I'm competing, that's the best style, right? I mean, if you want to go with that, okay, that's not true, right? Every style is your style. And you may use different styles in different circumstances because different styles are more appropriate for different circumstances. So this isn't an either or, this is one of those and situations, okay? So we're going to go through the styles. So the first style is competing. Then there's collaborating. Then there's avoiding and compromising. And finally, accommodating or harmonizing, okay? So let's look at the first style. Oh, sorry, this is all exciting, this flying in from the left. So collaborating is the first style, okay? I'm not going to ask you to identify yourselves, but you know who you are, the collaborators in the room, right? This can be characterized by 2 heads are better than 1, right? We're trying to solve things together. We're kind of talking through things. We're focused on kind of a win-win situation. Collaborating is definitely more helpful if you're trying to sort of leverage the collective IQ, like get everyone together and let's put our brains together and figure something out. Collaborating can be less helpful when you need to make a quick decision. Okay? Then sometimes taking the time to be collaborative is not all that helpful. Okay? So the next style is called compromising. Okay? This is everyone gives a little and takes a little. So, no one gets exactly what they want. There's kind of a middle ground, and a lot of people refer to this as being fair, right? Let's compromise. I'm going to give a little, you're going to give a little, and we're going to find kind of a middle ground for ourselves. Again, compromising is most helpful when you both want the same thing, and it can be divided. So it's okay that you give a little. It's okay that the other person takes a little. Compromising is less helpful when maybe if you spent a little bit more time, you could find sort of a better long-term solution. Sometimes compromise is referred to as a little bit of a short-term solution. So we're gonna compromise in the moment, and then we're gonna move on, right? And sometimes maybe you'd want to take a little more time and would come up with a more sustainable solution. Okay? Avoiding. Now, often people feel like, oh, I don't want to be an avoider. That's terrible. It's not terrible. Again, it has some helpful characteristics, and there's some times when it's less helpful. This could be perceived as, I'll leave that for another day. So you might pretend that nothing is wrong. You might delay something, and that's a really important strategy sometimes. So avoiding is more helpful when people need time to cool down. Right? Sometimes conversations or discussions are simply at a level that is unproductive for everyone involved. And so sometimes avoiding and delaying that conversation might actually be very helpful. Obviously, it's less helpful if you avoid and then decisions are made by default. Right? Then your input is not recognized, you do not have a say in the outcome, and you just kind of let things happen because you're not willing to invest yourself. Okay? The next, sorry. The last style is accommodating. Okay? You can have it your way, so you're kind of giving. Okay? Again, you may or may not be that invested in the outcome. If you've ever sort of been in a situation where it could be okay, it could be this way, it could be that way. You might want to be more accommodating. You tend to focus on the concerns of others rather than your own concerns. Again, it's more helpful. Maybe you're not sure that you're right, so you want to let someone else kind of have the floor. But it's less helpful when it sacrifices what could be a better solution. So when you give in and don't continue to work through something, sometimes you miss an opportunity, again, to find that better path. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, so let me ask you this. Was anyone surprised by their conflict style? I mean, you may want to be surprised, but like, were you actually surprised? Yes, Sarah, would you like to share with us? Thank you so much.
So I was actually surprised to see that my conflict style is competing, because I've always thought of myself as being more of a collaborator. But if I'm specifically thinking about my role on our school committee, I think that that has very much influenced my shift into a more competitive style, just out of necessity.
To different situations that we come across, and your style as a school committee member may be very different than your style in your workplace or in your family. And that's entirely possible. One of the things I want to remind you is that every style can be helpful and every style can be unhelpful. So please, this is not an either or, this is an and situation, okay? Carolyn, you want to jump in?
So I mentioned that a couple of years ago, I decided to become both a student and a practitioner of conflict resolution. This exercise was a revelation for me. I don't know if that's landed for anybody else that way, but it helped explain so much about many of the conflict situations I found myself in on school committee. I'm somebody who is highly collaborative in nature. Tim and I didn't have the pleasure of serving together. He joined school committee afterwards. But I always used to say that while there were plenty of people with whom I would always disagree on certain issues, nobody would ever be able to say that they weren't heard. I was very collaborative. I was very forgiving when it came to public comment. I wanted the collective IQ in the room to help us to get to better solutions. But what I found is that worked really well when the situation was relatively calm. If we were at the beginning of the stages of thinking about changing school start times, if we were at the beginning of the stages of thinking about putting in a new policy around transgender students, whenever we were at the beginning of something, I was awesome. I was all about designing these collaborative processes to help make sure that we got to a good result. But as soon as the situation became stormy, I struggled. And I would very quickly go to compromise and accommodating. And would oftentimes in those moments when I would get pushback from the rest of the committee, feel very much like a fish out of water. Because all of the things that I thought I brought to the table, all of those tools and techniques, all of a sudden they didn't work anymore. And what do I do next? And so for me, understanding that when emotions rise and when I get stressed, my style shifts. Just knowing that information, I think, is going to be incredibly helpful to me in the future. It certainly makes me reflect back on some of those times when my style shifted, and I think I would have handled those situations differently if I had had that level of self-awareness to realize what was happening in the moment. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolyn. So really, there are a couple of reasons why we do this, right? Knowledge is power. So you can take everything that you learned today and you can put it in a binder on your shelf and never look at it. That's okay. Or you might remember some of it. You might have been someone who was taking notes the whole time, and so you're going to really, really reflect on those. At the end of the day, whatever you take out of today, hopefully, when you go back to your school committees, when you go back to your communities, it will make you just reflect on things slightly more differently. Right? You're just going to take a slightly different approach. You might pause a little bit. You might say, ooh, that person's competing. Interesting. Oh, I didn't think about that, about the history of that conflict that maybe is leading to where we are today. So knowledge is power. We've talked about this over and over, but better communication. And again, you're going to have a session on that coming up. Communication is the key to everything. And finally, better results. Because as we all know, your role on the school committee is to positively impact student achievement. So at the end of the day, that's what all of this is driving towards. We can take as many inventories as we want. We can do as much, talk about conflict theory. But at the end of the day, the goal is to increase student achievement in each of your communities. So hopefully that makes a little sense. So we've got a couple of other things in your packet. We're not going to go through them right now, but there are some things that you can say that are really helpful, and then there are things you can say that are maybe less helpful. So just a couple of those for you. There are some quick tips on how to kind of navigate your way through conflict, again, through that bridge. Take a breath, reading the room. Again, these are all in your packet. You can look at those for yourself. There's some next steps for you, right, in terms of your professional development and your development in your communities. The Center for Mediation does a lot of work, as Carolyn mentioned earlier, with both individuals, groups. We work with community groups. We work with workplaces. We work with families. We work with lots of different people to help them navigate what is an increasingly challenging world to live in. So we're happy to sort of talk to you about any of those things. Carolyn, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Tricia. So that was a lot in a very short period of time. I really do feel like this is an iceberg, and we just kind of scratched the tip of it. But I think what I want to leave you with is, reflecting on my 8 years on school committee, and some of you, like Kathy, have been serving for a heck of a lot more. But it cannot be understated that school committees set the tone and tenor of a school district. And we started to talk a little bit about, well, what do you do about community members and blah, blah, blah. And I think, in a lot of ways, how we comport ourselves as school committee members is really so important in terms of setting that tone and tenor for the district. If you have group norms, again, we don't have time to do that. That could be a workshop in and of itself. If you have group norms about how you behave, how you treat each other, how you handle conflicts when they arise, these things can be incredibly helpful, and they serve as a model to the community and an example to the community of what productive engagement looks like to be able to move the needle forward. If you can avoid it, you don't want your school district to be one of those statistics that has a very high rate of superintendent turnover. And while there are certainly times where school committees and superintendents have legitimate disagreements, so often, many of those could be worked through if people were a little bit more reflective about their own conflict style and a little bit more intentional about addressing conflict resolution, both as a process and as a structure, so that you are acknowledging that conflict is absolutely inevitable, but able to work through it in a way that actually advances student outcomes rather than limits them. So I just want to thank you so much on behalf of Tricia and myself for having us here today. It was so fun to be back in the same room with you. Would love to see you all again at some point, and I'll just say enjoy the rest of your morning and the rest of your day. And if anybody has any comments or questions, we are going to take a break now, and Tricia and I are happy to stick around a little bit, but otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. And again, thank you so much for all that you do each and every day. It's much appreciated. Take care.
We're definitely going to be pushing or urging Hassenfeld to take into account the Center for Mediation and Collaboration's presentation and the programs that they offer. So, we'll be putting a good word in for Hassenfeld.